De Stijl, like other early 20th century modernist movements, had a manifesto to go with it. The term De Stijl actually in Dutch means the style, and this is a group of artists who emerged in the Netherlands, led by Theo van Doesburg, and perhaps the best known proponent of De Stijl, who's Piet Mondrian. Their ideas are about kind of expressing this universal abstract harmony. They think that color and order can reflect harmony, and they saw that as the goal of life. Now, their paintings tend to look like works that we perhaps saw with the Russian abstractionists, and most certainly they are inspired by the movements that are taking place in Russia, but they're also interested in Cubism and this breaking down of form that we're seeing in a number of styles emerging in the early part of the 20th century. Mondrian is really interested in kind of the mystical meaning of color and of forms. He talks about horizontal versus vertical. He says, for example, that paintings with red are more dominant, quote, more real than paintings with little or no color, which he said are more spiritual. So he's added a whole kind of philosophy to the way that he looks at color. But I think also what's interesting about this move towards abstraction that we still see with Mondrian and De Stijl is that while these are seemingly rigid, geometric forms, there's a sense of energy. There's also a sense of depth with these works. Objects, some squares seem to float forward, some seem to recede into space. He also, in the later works, used colored tape to design the canvases, and he designed his own frames out of wood that was painted white on gray and then set back from the frame. So it has a kind of sculptural quality to it as well. A kind of blending of the ideas of De Stijl and this approach to painting into architecture is perhaps best personified by the Schroeder House, which was done by Gerrit Rietveld, also in the Netherlands, and completed in 1923-24. Now, this would be a pretty modern house by our standards today. You can imagine how radically new and transformative this would have looked to audiences in the last century, right? The idea is that it would have this kind of flow from interior to exterior. It has big windows. The landscape is incorporated into the feel of the home. But in a sense, it's very austere. There's not a lot of luxury. There's no fabric. There's no lush padding. There's a real sense of simplicity that is a part of this design. And Rietveld worked very closely with Mrs. Schroeder, who lived in the house for 60 years. And she wanted to have this open, flowing, flexible space. So they designed these sliding partitions so that you could change the space and you could open it up, which is, of course, a very modern concept in architecture as well as design. Rietveld's best known work is probably the Van Gogh Museum, which was the last architectural structure he created before his death. Oh, he also did this chair where he writes about it, and he says, the construction is attuned to the parts to ensure that no part dominates or is subordinate to the others. In this way, the whole stands freely and clearly in space, and the form stands out from the material. This is important, this idea of taking something from fine art and turning it into a functional object. This will be really important for a group that we'll talk about shortly called the Bauhaus. And we know a little bit about this too from when we talked about the arts and crafts movement in England. And these two architects, brothers Charles Sumner Green and Henry Mather Green, are very much inspired by William Morris, who said that wonderful quote, "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful," as well as Japanese aesthetics. They loved the idea of kind of a holistic approach to design where you would be the architect not just of the exterior, but also of furniture, carpets, tiles, stained glass, and all of the interior decoration as well. So we are back in the United States looking at Green and Green. They created a series of affordable homes relatively inexpensively, which they called bungalows. And then they created 6 or 7, of which the Gamble House is one, ultimate bungalows. And the ultimate bungalows were the like amped up big version of these smaller homes. And actually the term bungalow comes from Hindi, and it refers to a house that has a broad porch. So what you're looking at here on the front of the house is a porch that wraps all the way around the front and the side. And up here on the top, this is actually what they called a sleeping porch at the time. It's screened in, and it was believed that it was very healthy for people to sleep outdoors. So this is a place that you can go visit. It's not too far away in Pasadena. It's open or there are tours that you have to get on that are scheduled. You'd have to check their website to see exactly when, but I highly recommend it because it is like walking into a sculpture of both interior as well as exterior design. Now, also in the United States is the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who begins his career in Chicago and founds his own firm in 1893 and is maybe the most influential architect of the 20th century. He too was very impressed by Japanese design, which he saw at a big exhibition in Chicago, and then later on travels to Japan. He also had ideas about how homes should relate to their landscape. So for example, the houses that he built in Chicago, this one, the Roby house, is very long. So I'm showing you the living room here, so that would be up here on the exterior. So you can see this long series of windows that again kind of brings the outside in, but also is so long that it reflects the landscape that is natural to the Midwest, the prairie. So these the Roby House and others that he built in and around Chicago are referred to as the prairie houses because they're long and echo the flat plains that we know to be part of the prairie. What's also interesting is that this is quite the opposite of standard architecture of the day. So his homes are radical. If you think of Victorian architecture as being kind of the standard, these homes have no relationship to the landscape, right? It dominates. It doesn't think about what the view or what the land around it looks like. It's a sculptural and architectural gem all on its own. But this idea of relating to nature that Frank Lloyd Wright brings to the forefront really is something very old. We see this in Maya structures where, for example, the Temple of the Moon and many other Mesoamerican buildings reflect the nature that surrounds them. And other Native American groups, like, for example, the Taos people or the Pueblo people around Taos, New Mexico, did very much the same thing. So that the undulating forms, the way that it builds up, this kind of plateau architecture tends to reflect the mountains that surround it. This is probably the zenith of that idea as manifest by Frank Lloyd Wright. This is Falling Water, for which I would say he's probably most famous, which he completed in 1964, and it's in western Pennsylvania, not too terribly far from Pittsburgh. And here he's also so interested in this idea of the integration between interior and exterior spaces, so much so that this waterfall, so this is the living room here, and the waterfall, there are stairs that go down to it, so when you're in the living room, you can hear the waterfall. So this is open. It can be closed off, because obviously it gets very cold in western Pennsylvania and also very hot. But nonetheless, you can also have this open space that allows you to hear the waterfall and literally be on it and part of it. And also, if you look at the nature in that area, the way it kind of comes down, the way there are caves and dwellings, the house also moves backwards into the landscape in much the same way that the falls do. And it has deep kind of cave-like rooms. Now, needless to say, while this is really innovative and interesting, there are problems that arise from architecture along these lines. And one of them is that humidity is an ongoing problem, and controlling the humidity in the house has long been a problem. This is a space that you can see designed by Frank Lloyd Wright right here in Los Angeles. It's called the Hollyhock House. It was designed for the oil heiress Aline Barnsdale in 1921. It's really in kind of East Hollywood today. It's in something called the Barnsdale Art Park. The name, the Hollyhock House, comes from the favorite flower of Mrs. Barnsdale, and that pattern and that motif is seen in various abstracted forms throughout the house. So this house is arranged around a central courtyard, so there's kind of a natural, easy flow between indoor and outdoor living. It's also a kind of split level design, and it's what's referred to as the Mayan revival because it looks back to the Mayan style of architecture. There's also a water element that goes with the Hollyhock House. There is a moat, yes, I did say a moat, that goes from the pool on the outside and it flows down into the living room. It actually goes around the fireplace. This, too, although very artistic and creative, and it transforms architecture into sculpture, was also conceived without a real understanding of Los Angeles rain patterns, and it's proved very problematic in terms of maintaining the home and making it livable. This space, by the way, is also open to the public for tours, and since 2019 has become or has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and probably the last great work created by Frank Lloyd Wright, is his Guggenheim Museum, which is in New York City, which was conceived as one continuous space. So if you were to start at the top, this is really just one floor that curves around kind of like a shell, a very organic form that contrasts strongly with the clear geometric grid of New York City. But it does seem to echo the undulating, winding paths of Central Park, which are right here on the left in this image across the street from the Guggenheim. It's also an incredibly popular museum. It's a great example of architecture as sculpture, but on some level, these curved walls have proved problematic for curators in terms of hanging art.